Hi and welcome back to Terry Talks Movies. This time around we're talking about a Canadian film director. David Cronenberg is the weirdest thing to come out of Canada since stuffed moose hearts for dinner. He is a terrific auteur. He's got a unique vision. He scared the hell out of a lot of people. He is deeply into body horror. And he also has a side hustle playing an enigmatic character on Star Trek Discovery. What's not to love about the guy? So I'm going to look at two of his movies from the early 1980s. For Cronenberg, these were very much breakthrough movies. They were filmed under extraordinary difficulties, but they're two of his iconic films, Scanners and Videodrome. So let's talk about them. The movie has a really good start. You've got a homeless guy in a shopping mall wandering through the food court, grabbing food off plates and feeding himself, looking around. He seems lost, he seems slightly mentally impaired. And a couple of rather wealthy women are sitting at a nearby table, and one of them starts whispering about him, and he picks up her thoughts. Moments later, she starts convulsing, having some kind of grand mal seizure, and that then draws the attention of a couple of men who are watching and following Cameron Vale, the character who is the homeless guy. They hit him with a tranquilizer dart as he runs through the shopping mall, and they take him to a laboratory run by a company called ComSec, and a man called Dr. Paul Ruth, played by Patrick McGowan. Ruth explains to Cameron that he's giving him a drug called ephemerol, which mutes the effects of his telepathic and telekinetic powers. Ruth has a plan. He wants to use Cameron Vale to infiltrate an underground of scanners that exists in the world. The scanners were caused by some drugs that were given to some women when they were pregnant, and that then led to a kind of birth deformity which gave the children psychic powers. He basically grooms and trains Cameron to be that person. Meanwhile, another scanner, Daryl Revick, played by Michael Ironside in his breakout role, is wandering around killing other scanners who won't join him and be recruited by him for his crusade to take down ComSec. So you've got three sides to things really. You've got Cameron Vale's side with a little bit of a side thing for Dr. Paul Ruth. You've got Revick and his people, and you've got the ComSec executives, personified by Lawrence Dane's character Braden Keller, who's a security guy for ComSec. Of all of Cronenberg's films, this one is more science fictional than a lot of the previous movies. Yes, the previous ones had body horror, but they tended to rely more on the horror side of things. But Scanners works. I mean, I watched it when it first came out. I've watched it a couple of times since then, and I watched it yesterday. And it rolls along nicely as a thriller. It takes its time and has its own pace. And that pace is very much in tune with the character of Cameron Vale. Because he can hear the thoughts of those around him, his mind has, since his childhood, been filled with the thoughts of other people. So he hasn't had time to develop much of a personality. And Stephen Lack, whether it's through skill or whether through his own inexperience as an actor, gives us that unformed character in a really interesting way. All through the film, we're seeing Cameron Vale finding out who he is and developing his own sense of self, because he is learning how to control his powers. He has some medication to help with them, and he is kind of new to the world in a way, and that makes it really interesting as well. You have a couple of other characters. You have a woman called Kim Obrist, played by Jennifer O'Neill, who, I think the role's underwritten personally. One of a group of renegade scanners who are basically just trying to keep their shit together and stay alive. And we see a gathering of those scanners, and we see them kind of communing with each other telepathically in order to keep each other sane. And that's the kind of stuff I would have liked to have seen a little more of in the movie, but it wasn't that type of movie. And it's also a theme that was developed in much more detail in the Netflix series Sense8 that J. Michael Straczynski wrote with the Wachowskis. And that series owes a lot to Scanners and develops the themes of Scanners in a much more complex and nuanced and international way. And one of the things I took away from the movie watching it this time was how great Cronenberg is at showing, not telling. When Dr. Ruth has Cameron strapped down to a bed and then fills the room with a whole bunch of volunteers so that Cameron starts getting incredibly distressed by the thoughts of all the people around him. The sound design and the kind of slow, clinical way in which it was done really gives us a sense of what this guy's going through. And the dialogue does a little bit of filling in the gaps on that. But for the most part, all of the psychic powers that we see, with a couple of very, very notable exceptions, are done through acting and directing and what the camera shows us of the world that these characters inhabit. And I really like that. I think also because the movie was made on a tight schedule and a tight budget, it was a very cost-efficient way of doing it. And that enhances the movie. There are just so many movies that kind of over-explain the unusual phenomena that they have in them. But this one makes you lean in a little bit. And I'm really, really in favour of movies that make you lean in and pay attention to them, particularly in this age of ubiquitous distraction, where you'll get a notification on your phone, or you'll think of something and look it up and that kind of thing. This movie really does draw your attention in a positive way so that you're really watching it. Of course, originally it was designed to be watched in the cinema, but by happy coincidence, it plays well to getting us as an audience to avoid the external distractions while we're watching the movie. And this is also the start of Cronenberg's dalliance with Cyberpunk. The scenes where Cameron, using a phone line, taps into the computer system concept to find out the names and addresses of people who may be scanners and the doctors who prescribed ephemeral, the drug, to their pregnant mothers, is very much proto-cyberpunk. 1981, cyberpunk was just starting as a literary phenomenon. I mean, people like Bruce Sterling and William Gibson and Pat Cadigan were already working in developing the aesthetic of cyberpunk. And whether he was aware of that literary side of things or not, Cronenberg really taps into that in an interesting way to show that the computer systems and the computer networks and the wide computer networks that we had in the 1980s were a rudimentary form of nervous system. And that leap to see computer networks as a kind of nervous system is a very cyberpunk kind of thing. As I said, there were some problems making the movie. One of them, oddly enough, was Patrick McGoohan, not because he couldn't do the job, because he very much could. His character, Paul Ruth, is a nice, subtle performance by McGoohan. He has a lot of the explaining to do about what scanners are and how they work. And that info dump is really interesting because of his acting. Problem is that McGoohan had a few issues as a human being. First off, he was an alcoholic. He was drinking because he had enormous problems with self-loathing and kind of low self-esteem. And he had enormous stage fright before he went on screen, or even on stage. He did some work on stage at the time as well. So he had this enormous stage fright that he had to overcome. A lot of good actors do. Olivier did. A number of other actors do as well, and then perform brilliantly while they're on screen or on stage. But McGoohan had that as an issue, and it's probably why he didn't do more work than he actually did. I think that he was riding his nerves a lot as an actor, and yet on the screen he's kind of quiet and scholarly. Dr. Paul Ruth is a really interesting character, and right at the end of that particular role, when you see him falling apart, for the first time watching the movie, I've seen the movie about 3 or 4 times, for the first time I realised that part of that falling apart was the fact that Cameron Vale, the telepath, was tapping into his brain while the man who kills him was creeping up on him. And I kind of liked that subtlety of approach that Cronenberg had for this particular scene. Now, of course, then we go to the really big ones, the exploding head of Louis Delgrand. when Revok sits down for a demonstration of how scanners work and being a bit of a cuckoo in the nest, while the minor league scanner, played by Louis Del Grand, decides to do a demonstration of his abilities. Chris Wallace, who did the makeup effects and the kind of practical splatter effects in Scanners, had real problems with that scene. The exploding head was an enormously difficult thing to put across. They tried all sorts of things. They tried different things to stuff into the head to make it look realistic. And ultimately they came up with a formula for the right stuff to put in the head. But they couldn't get it to blow up properly. If they put squibs in it, there'd be smoke and things that didn't look realistic coming out of the head. So ultimately they filmed it in the back of a truck with a black curtain on all sides, and Chris Wallace laying on the floor with a shotgun to blow the head off. It's a very effective special effect, arguably more effective than some of the effects later on when Revok and Cameron Vale have their psychic battle, which manifests physically in injury to each other. Though I do like the vein effects in that part. That worked for me really well. Just to kind of summarise, Scanners, it works solidly. I'm going to ignore the 2 sequels and the 2 spin-offs. I don't think it's a movie that needs remaking. I think the approach that Straczynski took with Sense8 is the right one, to be influenced by Scanners, but not necessarily to be locked into that intellectual property. But this is a nice blending of an action movie and also of Cronenberg's continuing obsession with body horror and body transformation. He did move away from that theme for a while with movies like Eastern Promises, A Dangerous Method, Cosmopolis, and Map to the Stars, which I like a lot. I like Map to the Stars. I think it's a solid kind of hidden gem movie with a really good script by Bruce Wagner. But since then, Cronenberg's kind of dived back into his body horror thing with Crimes of the Future, which is the second movie he's made called Crimes of the Future, which I haven't seen yet, but I'm looking forward to watching. Cronenberg's an interesting director. I mean, I'm just looking at his IMDb now. Stereo, Crimes of the Future, Shivers, Rabid, Fast Company, The Brood. I've got to do The Brood for a future video. The Dead Zone, The Fly, Dead Ringers, Naked Lunch, and Butterfly, which is interesting. Crash, Existence. I want to do Existence for another video as well, because I like that one as well. And then he went off to do Spider with Ralph Fiennes, History of Violence, Eastern Promises. Yeah, he's kind of had range, and he's moved in and out of genre work for a lot of his later career. That he kind of did a palate cleanser by doing different kinds of movies for how long? Let me have a look. For a good 20 years before coming back to Crimes of the Future. Cronenberg's always interesting. Sometimes his movies are the kind of movies you don't want to watch while you're eating lunch. So that then brings us to Videodrome. Videodrome I like a lot as a movie. I think that it's dated in a way. It's very much stuck in the 1980s with this obsession with cathode ray televisions and videotape formats. But it kind of works. And after Scanners, this is Cronenberg diving deeper into cyberpunk. It really gives us an interesting, thought-provoking and deeply, deeply weird view of the way that media is injected into the human mind by people who don't have our best interests at heart. It starts out with Max Wren, played by James Woods, who always played kind of sleazy characters, and having seen his recent efforts in social media and political commentary is not entirely surprising. Max Wren runs Channel 83, a TV channel that specialises in kind of softcore porn and sleazoid kind of output. He's looking for new product, and the pirate satellite dish that's on the roof of their TV station picks up a signal from something called Videodrome, which seems to be showing torture porn and real life torture as a part of the programming that they're secretly bouncing off satellites to an unknown market of people who like that kind of thing. And Max becomes obsessed with Videodrome. At the same time, while doing a talk show on a local TV station, he gets involved with a kind of sexologist radio show woman called Nikki Brand, played by Deborah Harry, who is very much sex positive and very much into kinkier sexual practices. And I like the way that the movie doesn't make judgments about that. It makes judgments about people who find that kind of thing repugnant and who think that they can tell other people what they can and can't do with their bodies. But it's very much non-pejorative about even some quite extreme sexual preferences among consenting adults. And I like that. I like the way that it kind of keeps that ground and doesn't yield to the forces of evil, let's say. Now, Nikki and Max start a relationship which gets quite transgressive at times. She gets Max to pierce her ears while they're making love, which is that combination of pleasure and pain which the character is into. And of course, names are very important in this movie. So Nikki Brand, her surname, is kind of leads into that kinkier pain pleasure kind of sex that the character's into. And there's a character called Dr. Brian Oblivion, who is a media prophet. I want to use that title. I think that'd be a good title for me. Media prophet, movie prophet, who runs a kind of outreach mission which has a soup kitchen called the Cathode Ray Mission, where people who miss out on TV are sat in little cubicles so they can watch TV. Homeless people, people who don't have access to media in other ways. Because the Church of the Cathode Ray Mission basically says that television is more important than human beings, and that human beings are influenced and are kind of ascend through the medium of television. And the character of Dr. Brian Oblivion only ever appears on video. He hasn't had a conversation with other people because his chosen form of communication is videotape. So that's kind of interesting too. That kind of philosophy is way out there, but kind of consistent with the ubiquitousness we now find with screens and media and video, he says, while putting out a video on a streaming platform. Now, Videodrome itself is a kind of weird but brilliant idea. It's television weaponized against individuals. Watching the Videodrome signal causes brain tumors which induce hallucinations, and we see Max starting to fall into that and be influenced in very, very creepy ways that blend technology with sensuality and with the flesh. And one of the core concepts in the movie, of course, is the new flesh, which is kind of mutable based on the signals coming from television transmissions. And we find out the Videodrome is actually not coming from somewhere far away, but it's coming from a company called Spectacular Optical, run by a guy called Barry Convex. And Spectacular Optical isn't a television company. It's a company that basically runs optometrist shops and also does some telescopic sights and things like that for the military. And by some means, Spectacular Optical has come up with a technology that allows people to be programmed and changed by the Videodrome signal that they create. And it's not reliant on the type of media in which it is pushed to the consumer. Spectacular Optical has made a decision to basically brainwash people who are into kinky sex by piggybacking their technology onto the Videodrome signal. We then get the body horror hallucinations that Max undergoes, the fact that both a gun and a video cassette are inserted into his body, the fact that his television becomes an organic thing that pulses and writhes and responds to touch. And the funny thing is too that Max Wren's format for the videotapes that are put into him is Betamax rather than VHS or Umix. So basically Max is programmed to assassinate people and becomes a kind of cyberpunk Manchurian Candidate kind of character, until the Cathode Ray Mission and the daughter of Brian Oblivion, Bianca Oblivion, played by Sonia Smits, reprograms Max to be something else. This movie has more ideas than it can cram into its running time. It's crazily prophetic in a sense in the ways that television has been weaponized. We're not getting videotapes jammed into our guts now. We're getting false information fed to us through various nefarious news media. But the principle remains the same. And I'm not sure that the ending particularly works well. I think that there were 3 endings shot for the film. And the one they went with was the one that James Woods wanted. The last 10 minutes or so lets down a lot of the rest of it. I think something a little more transcendent was called for. But imagine if something like the cathode ray mission existed today. It'd have to be the OLED mission or the 4K widescreen smart TV mission. Media's changed a lot since the 1980s, and I find that really interesting. And yet the concepts that Cronenberg brings up in Videodrome and the kind of religious obsession that people have with media in general is something that's very much still relevant. And Cronenberg in the early 1980s was at the state of the art of cyberpunk. Cyberpunk was still being produced up until about 1985, 1986. By the time things like Johnny Mnemonic and other movies based on Gibson's work came out, literary science fiction had moved on to things like Afrofuturism and First Nations voices in science fiction and other kind of interesting elaborations on the genre, which I recommend that people really dive into. And it's good to see that Gibson's recent novel, The Peripheral, has been made into a streaming series on, I think, Amazon Prime. Fine novel. I've read the novel and I recommend it highly. I'm going to wait to watch the series until all the episodes are out so I can binge them. It looks like a really interesting project and one that I'm sure I'll at least find fascinating. But anyway, that's it for this time around. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and hit the notification bell so you know when new stuff comes out. You can also support the channel by donating a little bit every month at patreon.com/paleocinema. I've got a couple more videos up my sleeve and I'm looking forward to doing them. I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into 1980s films that I like, and I've got a couple of other things as well going on. In the meantime, look after yourselves, play safe, watch good movies, watch bad movies. Dive back into the early cinema of David Cronenberg and you're going to have your head spun around 3 or 4 times in a very entertaining way. So until then, take care of yourselves and I'll catch you next time.